different kinds of debates in speech and debate. There's policy, PF, and LD. Now, policy and PF are a two-person debate, while LD is a one-person debate. This is the first way in which they differ. The second way in which they differ is that LD has something called a value and a criterion. Now, these are very central and very important to understanding LD debate, and they're pretty easy to understand, so I'll be explaining them just in more detail. The value of LD debate is like the central argument. It's like your thesis of your debate, but it's usually just an idea or an object. Most often, though, it's kind of a theory type thing because LD is very heavily weighted in theories and morality and things like that. So your value tends to be theory, like the central theory in which you base your whole argument. The criterion is the lens at which you look through this theory, in which you examine it and at how you weigh it. The criterion also tends to be something tangible that can be tracked, either something that can be tracked through the census or just any other documents. It is something that can be measured, because you need to have something that can be measured, because you can't have a debate based on pure theory in like high school, or really ever. But the main way that I like to remember value and criterion is that value is kind of like a microscope chip, and criterion is with the lens through which you are examining it. It's kind of a nerdy way to look at it, but it helps me. An easy resolution to which maybe we can make some practice value and criterions to help understand it would be resolved. Apples are the best fruit. Now, for the affirmative side, you could talk about, for your values, you could have health value and color and luster and cost and just things like that that are weighted in the apple's favor. And your criterion for this would be economic viability, ecological viability, nutrition contents, or maybe more specifically than nutrition contents, you could focus on a specific vitamin or maybe even calorie count. And just like tangible things like that can be tracked easily. But for the criterion side of this, you need to make sure that it is tangible, because you can't have something for an apple where it's like color and then your criterion be like red, because while apples tend to be red, those things don't really correlate, and it isn't really a tangible thing to measure. You can't measure the degree of red. For the negative side of the debate, what you're going to have for your value is going to be something like maybe citrus content, because this is highlighting a key negative in apples. It's showing that, hey, apples do not have a high citrus content, and this can be filled with other things such as oranges, lemons, limes, things really citrusy. And for a criterion, you would be talking about like vitamin C, kind of things like that, if that makes sense. Now on to a more complex topic that I did last month in the April-March range. The United States ought to promote democracy in the Middle East. Now first you're going to want to analyze the resolution. Ought. Ought is a moral obligation. So your value and criterion is going to be something based in morality rather than something based in like real world values. It's something based in morality. For the affirmative side, I chose to talk about human rights for my value. Now, something very important to note when you're writing cases is that you need to define your value and your criterion. This does two things. It makes sure that you and your opponent are both talking about the same thing and you're both arguing the same thing, because it wouldn't make for a very interesting or good quality debate if you're both talking about completely different things. And also, this lets your judge know what you're talking about, because the judge could have an idea about what human rights are, but when you define what human rights are in your world or your realm, the judge is acknowledging and has to go by your definition of what human rights are. Now, the definition I used for human rights was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, signed and adapted by all nations of the UN. Now, I think that this is a very good definition of human rights because it's something that's almost universally adapted, and it's something very strong made up by many countries, and it's just overall a good definition. It's much better than something that you would get off of Webster's English Dictionary. It's something that's based in a, a coalition of countries, and it has a lot of backing. Um, my criterion for this, which was much weaker, was influence, and I'm saying basically here, like the only human rights that we can measure are the ones gained through the United States is influence. A much better criterion to have used would have been like democracy. Like we're looking at the human rights that are gained through the promotion of democracy in the Middle East. Um, on my negative side, I talked about self-determinationism, and I brought up like imperialism and how imperialism kind of caused all the problems that are currently occurring in Middle East, and how by the US promoting a type of government we like, that's kind of a form of like neo-imperialism, which would just cause more destabilization in the Middle East. And for my criterion, I talked about political security, which is again talking about how we can only measure self-determinationism if it is gotten through political security. And another thing, just kind of a last quick note that you need to know about value and criterion, is you need to reiterate them throughout your criterion, or your contentions. You need to talk about, like, at the end of each contention, you need to talk about how they tie back in together. Like, for one of my examples, I talked about Malala, and then I talked about how this shows an increase in human rights because she fought for democracy. You need to make sure that you can tie that back into all your contentions, because one, that strengthens your contention, and two, if they do not tie back into your contentions, your opponent can just throw your case out, throw that contention out specifically and say that it's non-topical because it doesn't relate to anything that you're debating about. So that's basically everything that you need to know about the value and criterion. One, you just really need to make sure that it relates directly back to what you're talking about. Two, you need to make sure that they complement each other, because if they don't complement each other, then it really makes no sense and there's no point in having them, really. And three, you need to have strong definitions for them, because the stronger the definition, the harder it is to argue it. And you just need to make sure, again, that these definitions tie back into what you can prove and what you can argue.